If you're looking for a video that focuses on Elden Ring's positives, then this is not going to be it. I think we need a little more criticism in the FromSoftware community, and coming from people who don't simply not enjoy the game design philosophy of FromSoftware and end their criticisms there. I happen to be somebody that really likes it, and it can at times make me biased in ignoring certain issues. But I'm confident in saying that didn't happen much with Elden Ring, and you're probably going to get that eventually throughout the video. I'm not going to be sugarcoating this critique at all, pretending I like things about the game which I don't, or trying to come up with any minor positive thing to say in between my criticisms, as if anything that'd only make my explaining of what I thought about the game rather confusing, and it eludes the real good things I have to say about it. I hope the hype train has ended its journey at this point and people are ready to actually look at the game critically, and if not, at least accept other people's differing opinions about it like a normal person, without going hollow. Some disclaimers: this is not going to be a commentary, but it will still be very spoiler heavy, so if you care about that in FromSoft games, and you should, then well, there you go. This is also not going to be the most well-structured video that I've done. It starts off with some positives, then goes into my main critique of the game and spirals out into some other things, and finally ends with some more positives. But it's probably the best way I could have structured it for the things I want to talk about. One of the most attractive things about Elden Ring upon its release was undoubtedly the open world. Usually, if I heard the phrase open world Souls, I would most likely think horrible Souls-like attempt by some developer no one's ever heard of before. But of course, an official FromSoft title was more like this. It looked absolutely massive, and even from the little we saw of it, incredibly diverse while still being beautiful and basically without compromises. And of course, there was also that idea about the gameplay design of the open world itself. There's simply no way they don't finally do something amazing like Dark Souls 1 when it comes to the world, right? Not the same thing, but something different that's just as brilliant. And the open world in Elden Ring lives up to those expectations. It probably isn't going to take Witcher 3's spot for the most beautiful game I've ever played, but I'll easily put it in second. Being more specific, it, much like The Witcher 3, has both a very bold color palette and astounding art direction. These two things will undoubtedly cement it as the ridiculously beautiful game that it is for years to come, even if our ability to do better and better pure graphics keeps increasing. Many games today kind of have a tendency to lean towards boring and drab colors even if they're fantastically themed, which is what makes Elden Ring's over-the-top presentation stand out even more. You have everything from disgusting blood-red swamps to lonely and quiet snowy landscapes to castles surrounded by sprawling nature, which feel like they came not only from a different game but from a different developer entirely. I love the original Souls games' drab colors because they actually play into the philosophy of the games and have a purpose. But this is not Dark Souls. This is a different game, and that colorfulness works very well for it. Sekiro had that too, but not to the extent to which Elden Ring took it, though again, how Sekiro did it worked perfectly for what it was trying to be. I'm a very visual person when it comes to, well, pretty much any art which features any kind of visual elements, and Elden Ring managed to scratch all of my itches. Even The Witcher, which can make you stop in place what feels every other minute to stare at just how beautiful everything is, didn't do it quite as much as Elden Ring did it for me. At times it almost feels like there are these cliffs and mountains and other places which they must have started with and then built everything around them so they could nudge you towards them whilst you're playing and tell you, come on, go look over there, and then have you do so and see the literal wallpaper that they designed for you to look at. Only that's not the case because you get that feeling no matter where you look from. Elden Ring world is like a painting which you get to enter and walk around in, which brings me to my next point, why Elden Ring is actually part of the Souls On to our next point, of course, Elden Ring's world is not only there as a generator for endless desktop wallpapers, though you'll probably get your money's worth that way too, it's also there to be explored, and while the beauty does greatly contribute to that exploring being fun, as I made plenty clear already, the open world's design is nothing to underestimate. In Elden Ring, the world is not a flat plain like in many open world games. Of course, those games have little valleys and caves and hills and even mountains too. I'm not saying Elden Ring won Game of the Year because you can go up and down, but you really can go surprisingly up and especially surprisingly down. Elden Ring is so strange with its extreme elevation that it ironically goes full circle, and I still find it impossible to suspend my disbelief and forget that it is a game, but not because everything looks like a flat game, but because I'm constantly preoccupied with wondering how the hell it is that they designed all of this. As if the world isn't gigantic enough already, it can practically feel like it stretches just as much vertically as it stretches horizontally. High places are connected by these hanging bridges and sticking out cliffs that almost feel as if they shouldn't be there, and while the cave system underneath the map does have a rather straightforward straightforward way of arriving at, that being taking an elevator for what seems an eternity before finally arriving, it is still a great moment whenever it happens to you for the first time, and even the times to come, as you keep saying to yourself, there's literally no way there's another giant cave in this game, it's not possible, before finding one in the next area. It's really the sheer extremity that's so great about the discovery of these caves, and it perhaps best exemplifies Elden Ring's vast world. But the caves are also in their own little pocket dimension, constructed much the same as everything else above ground is, concerning how their parts are connected. I mean, it is essentially just another map with its own sky and body of water. Something I came to love about Elden Ring's open world only on my second playthrough is that you can go almost anywhere immediately. That's rather obvious, but when you know where a lot of stuff is, it allows for very interesting approaches. Linear Souls games still have that, but in a different way. You can learn where every single upgrade item is and get the most you can early on, but that's still limited to your linear path, which Elden Ring isn't. If you're good enough, you can choose to take any progression you feel like. You don't even have to try, as it's very easy to get lost and end up somewhere you shouldn't be. And if you've played Dark Souls 1 and to an extent Sekiro, you'll know that can be a very fun thing. And that's about wrapping up the good things I have to say about Elden Ring's open world. Okay, that's not quite true. There are a bunch of more things that I like about it, but they need to be tied to issues that I have to introduce first. Speaking of that, I have 4 general issues with Elden Ring. I'll approach them in terms of severity, starting with the most minor one and really the only minor one: confusion. I'm not very good at navigation. If you asked me to explain where certain things are or draw a vague map of a game after completing it, even if I played it for more than 100 hours, I probably wouldn't be able to. That's why I'm very hesitant in approaching this as an issue in Elden Ring, as it's completely possible that the problem is 100% on my part. But I doubt that, because I rarely have experienced that problem to the extent that I did in Elden Ring. I feel like I pretty much had to Google shit or ask a friend that had played the game 5 times if I wanted to progress at certain places when I got stuck on my first playthrough, and didn't want to waste, no kidding, 1 hour trying to figure stuff out, as it isn't the most enjoyable thing. Now, I don't mind some figuring out here and there, and obviously the optional stuff doesn't relate to that, and after all, you aren't really actively using your brain for a lot of this game anyway. But there's always a limit. The graces and the arrow glitter things are designed to help with this, and they do, somewhat, but not that well and not that reliably, with certain places being locked off and such. And the way the world is designed, still reminiscent of a Souls game with all these little nooks and crannies, leaves you constantly paranoid as you're forced to walk by things and end up forgetting them forever. It happens all the time, and it sucks. It's a shitty feeling reminiscent of Hollow Knight, and it happens to be probably my absolute biggest problem with that game, that you again and again find yourself backtracking and running around for hours when you unlock something new, since you don't have literal superhuman memory. Again, I'm labeling this as a very minor issue, also because it isn't the end of the world in terms of being unenjoyable, as I can easily fix it myself when it does happen, albeit in not a great way. It's a problem that's in part on my part, but Elden Ring definitely exacerbates it, despite the fact that it's supposed to be designed in a more structured way to avoid this, going from zone to zone. There are still many quests and areas which I had to skip and backtrack to, yet end up forgetting about for a long while, or simply missed in the first place and returned 30 levels over what I should have been, and I'm not the only one that felt like this. Knowing George R.R. Martin was involved in designing Elden Ring's world gave me a lot of hope that we'd have world building of a caliber we don't usually get in video games, or at least not the type of world building we usually get. And in terms of writing, it is an interesting world. But when it comes to exploring the world as an actual world instead of through the lens of its design as in level design on a larger scale as we did earlier, and even still pertaining to its design as in what the world actually consists of, then it becomes not so good. Sure, Elden Ring's world is big and very open, but it's also empty, or at least it feels like it, in a way that's only natural since you can explore so quickly with Torrent. Having it be too crammed would defeat the purpose of having a horse and also the purpose of an open world altogether, since you might as well make it a classic Souls game at that point. But Elden Ring has taken it to the other extreme. In almost every zone I can count on one hand the list of things to do. You have some dungeons, some settlements with enemies you can probably one-shot, a merchant or two, some interesting actually difficult monsters that you'll probably see again and again in another zone, and maybe a couple of interesting things. And all of these things you run to and from through these empty spaces which seem so expansive at times. Elden Ring's world is not alive. It has enemies because it needs to have enemies, and that's where you put an end to it. This is also the case for previous Souls games, but it's different here because it's an actual open world. In a way, this emptiness is what ruins how greatly the open world is actually constructed. It looks really interesting to explore, But it really isn't, and even something like the Round Table Hold, which could have been put in an actual village or castle in the world to add just a little more life, is instead simply separated from it. And yes, lore reasons, probably I haven't watched that many Vati videos yet, but I'm speaking about the emptiness here. This extends to other odd things, such as how Melina only appears so rarely throughout the entire game that I genuinely forget she exists sometimes. And perhaps that's the intention, she simply lingers in a way and that makes her actual appearances more special. But they never are. You never sit at these specific graces they've chosen to have her at and suddenly notice her standing at some unique spot just sitting there. She simply materializes in front of you and gives you some boring dialogue and then she leaves. Maybe I'm too invested in this whole maiden thing, but oh well. If I had to put it shortly, it feels like I'm playing another empty and depressing Souls game, only it's depressing in a bad way now because I don't think it's supposed to be as such. Here's a thing a lot of people say. There are dozens of secrets and questlines in Elden Ring. It's not that there's nothing to do, the game just doesn't hold your hand. I like Elden Ring's quests. It's true that they very much don't hold your hand and that's how it's always been in FromSoft's games. I'm happy they don't give you a quest tab just because it's an open world game. The mystery of these quests, much like with the general story of FromSoftware's games, is what elevates them from little interesting to very interesting. But I still consider most of these quests secrets, and having to look for things to do is not something I would attribute as a positive to the open world. They are a very nice extra and they do add to the world feeling more full, but its emptiness needs to be filled before that, because they cannot do that. Secrets cannot qualify as part of the main activities of an open world. In my eyes, an open world generally needs activities that you run into and basically jump out at you, and secrets are only a sort of deeper second floor to that. It's as if the iceberg was 90% below ground instead of 60. Wrapping this up with a minor observation, for being known for their bosses, it's very weird to me that FromSoft never sees the opportunity to have giant bosses roaming the world wherever they want, or just any bosses. There are some, but they are uninteresting exceptions. I know restrictive arenas are at times needed to make bosses properly tailored and not easily explorable, but I think they could have made it work. It doesn't even have to be a necessarily complex boss, just something astounding to look at like the giant rock turtle castle things. I love these guys. Elden Ring doesn't scale, so you end up fighting a lot of bosses that are way too high a level for you, and a lot that are way too low, which is way worse than what I want to focus on, since with levels like with Salt, you can always add more but you can't take any away. Many times I recall hitting a boss and seeing a third of their health bar disappear and saying to myself, well, isn't that just wonderful? And it's not like I farm echoes even. Like we'll talk about in a second, it's kind of just impossible to lose them if you're paying attention, so perhaps that's one of the suspects. But overall, it's undeniably the open world that's at fault here. This is also a problem with ordinary enemies, but unlike with the catacombs of Dark Souls 1, you're most likely to notice it with bosses here, as you can run past all the skeletons you want. This is not a problem that arises from the game being a particular type of open world, but due to it being an open world at all. This is how this format functions. You get to go anywhere, yet you get to go anywhere. This was a very big form of anxiety for me while playing, constantly worrying that I'm doing things out of order and will end up over-leveled for an area or boss. It was there when playing Dark Souls 1 as well, which isn't even a traditionally open-world game, and I still ended up over-leveled on many occasions throughout Elden Ring, and this is not a good thing for such a combat-oriented experience. This is an open-world game, so why do I have to figure out this very precise way of progression? Ultimately, I'm glad Elden Ring doesn't have scaling. Scaling shouldn't be needed in a well-designed open-world game, and in a way it goes against the unified experience of the Souls philosophy, ironically. And personally I don't like it, as it's devoid of any logic that isn't video gamey, which is something I hate in most games. But even with the mandatory gatekeeping bosses of Elden Ring, the high degree of freedom remains a big problem. Freedom is nice, but it means there is way too specific of a progression if you want to avoid decimating areas and even bosses. And if there's one type of game in the world where that's as unfortunate as it gets, it's a Souls game. Finally, there is my fourth issue with the open world, and before continuing with it, we need to establish something. Elden Ring is a Souls game. An open world Souls game, but a Souls game nonetheless. It plays like a Souls game, the bosses could be placed in Dark Souls 3 and work, the bonfires and Estus flasks and souls and fog walls are all there. It could easily pass as Dark Souls 4 with some reskins and renaming of things, and I guess excluding the lore. Anyhow, now that we've gotten that out of the way, what is my biggest, at least biggest direct problem with Elden Ring's world being an open world is that of what I'll call the non-boss experience. Souls games are objectively best known for their difficulty, and what is best known for its difficulty in Souls games are the bosses. They are the poster children of FromSoftware at this point, but everything outside the boss rooms is almost as much a part of that challenging experience, the making your way through enemies with dwindling healing items. Bosses are essentially these big, catastrophic and blood-pumping encounters that happen here and there throughout the game, but it's everything in between that keeps your attention with its ups and downs and random non-scripted events that may just randomly set you back 20,000 souls if they feel like it, and it's too what adds all that oppression to the worlds and thus adds to the worlds themselves in a great little narrative manner. And that simply isn't in Elden Ring. You can mostly teleport to any divine grace of your choosing at any time, which completely removes the non-boss experience. It makes everything feel even more empty and without stakes, something I never thought I'd be complaining about in a Souls game of all things. For most of the time, you can only lose your echoes if you're an idiot, frankly, and there is none of that claustrophobia or any such thing that I've grown to love so much about Souls games. Legacy dungeons are the exception to this, and it's what makes them the coolest parts of the game for me. For those that don't know, Legacy dungeons are the areas that carry on the legacy of traditional Souls level design, with more cramped spaces and linear paths, and also what is most important to me, the inability to teleport between checkpoints at all, unlike in Dark Souls 1, or more specifically, simply the inability to teleport whenever. The fact that you also can teleport even when at a grace is only a bonus, as it gives me an even stronger break from the "oh, you can teleport" world of Elden Ring. Sadly, whilst there are a good number of legacy dungeons, they're still not enough for me, though I guess they'd never be enough since I dislike how the open world works so much. My perfect balance would be many legacy dungeons and little to no open world. In other words, Dark Souls 4 or Dark Souls 1+. Perhaps they could have kept the legacy dungeons as is and simply made open world teleportation the same as in the previous games, from grace to grace. You could argue that it's the way it is since you have a horse and you'd be able to run past enemies and to the nearest grace whenever you want anyway, so it might as well be faster if you wish, but that's not always the case. Not only can you get pushed off your horse or your horse can get killed, but there are a good number of areas where you can teleport but you can't horse. It's not only legacy dungeons. There are also little houses and castles and such which are not legacy areas but are otherwise crammed and very easy to get killed in. But yet again, those types of areas, which also happen to be truly challenging at the same time, are few and far in between. And although it does contribute to the problem, it's not purely the way that the open world is designed that makes it work as such against the Souls non-boss experience, but the fact that it's an open world at all. We also need to talk about just how many damned graces there are. They seem to be increasing more and more with each game that follows, but it's so much more ridiculous in this game due to the reasons we mentioned. Even with fewer graces there would have been close to no stakes in anything, let alone with this many, and so many of them are not useful at all. You'll run through an area with literally nothing in it other than some eagles and turtles and find a grace on the other side. And while there may not be stakes in anything, you do have the stakes of Marika, which you can respawn at if any are close by instead of at your last grace if you prefer, and although they are pretty nice when placed near bosses, I really think the graces are very much enough. And why is there no stake before Placidusax, by the way? There aren't even enemies on that path to the boss, you just have to run a lot. You might say that the classic FromSoft non-boss experience isn't the point of Elden Ring, since it's an open world game and feeling cornered doesn't make sense with that, though not only does the game itself go against that a lot of the times as I said, but if that's not the point, then what is? I'm not playing for the story, or the visuals, or the soundtrack, or anything else. Those are things I've always loved about every FromSoft game, and they are always on par with almost any game you can think of, but I'm never playing for them. I'm playing for the gameplay, the challenge of it specifically, as without it, Souls combat is just not that interesting. They are built around difficulty, these games, and even something like the brilliance of Sekiro and how amazingly satisfying it is would instantly become incredibly boring without the difficulty, as it's built around it too. The game lacks that constant and unrelenting stress and doubt of whether you're going to make it or not, which is what sets the games apart from their contemporaries and essentially makes them that much needed fresh break from other titles. Perhaps I expected too much Souls from Elden Ring when I should have instead gone in for The Witcher. Of course, it's still kind of fun to exterminate everything and collect every item in FromSoft's games, but it's not as fun as in other Souls titles, especially with the open world, which makes it feel like there's no progression of that exterminating that's so oddly satisfying. Enemies have always respawned, but it's very easy to imagine in your head that you've cleansed these places of their monsters and essentially completed the games, even if you know most of the enemies will be waiting for you again if you return. And that's not how it is in Elden Ring, even for someone that loves completion as much as me. You could say Elden Ring is not supposed to be a video gamey game, and I already mentioned that with the scaling. But for me, Souls games are still in part very video gamey games. Video gamey games that don't scream video gamey in your face, if you wanna call it that. At first I thought I simply wasn't that into the FromSoft format anymore. Sekiro I enjoyed, but I guess that was the last one, and it was a fairly different experience than the others besides. But no, it's not that. It's just that Elden Ring is that OG format on one side, yet it's also so incredibly disconnected from it on the other side, the open world. And it lacking that part of the experience is a major detriment to other parts of the experience as well, and ultimately the entire experience itself. All in all, the open world doesn't really bring that much to the table, and knowing that it's a large undertaking and took an incredible amount of work, it's sad that it's taking into account all the things which it influences, certainly outweighed by the things it takes away. Speaking of that, we're not done yet. You've probably figured that out looking at the video's length. There is one other aspect of the game which the open world does not technically directly affect. However, I believe the game being open world does certainly lead to a very odd mindset concerning that particular aspect, or I guess it would be more fair to say aspects, and it's what makes them fall flat on their faces in more ways than one. But before we get into that, let's take a little break. Let's talk about some other things which have little to nothing to do with our main topic, because why not, starting with the horse combat. The horse combat in Elden Ring is another thing I was rather excited about following the game's announcement and trailers, albeit of course to a lesser extent than with the open world. And I guess I shouldn't make it a habit to look forward to such things anymore, that being any things at all, as the horse combat turned out to be not only nothing special, but overall kinda stupid. The moment I actually got to try it, I realized it isn't very interesting and simply doesn't work well with enemies that weren't designed for it. And I reckon that's fine, even though it's an open world game and all, and I would have liked to use it whenever I could, but that's just me expecting too much. But then I also realized that it isn't very interesting with enemies that weren't designed for it either. You just kind of run away and run back in and hit them until you kill them. It's actively painfully boring. The Night Cavalry is seriously such a surreally horrible fight for the kind of game I thought I was playing. It's as if you've been transported to the 90s, booting up some fever dream game that has no real mechanics and is meant to fascinate you only with the fact that it's a working game and you can play it. Oh, and fighting flying enemies is almost as if not just as annoying. I don't know which psychopath in FromSoftware thought having these come up so many times throughout the game was a good idea, but something bad needs to happen to them. Same with the shielded enemies, but they've been doing these since forever, so I've just accepted them at this point. They still do them and they still suck, and that's pretty much it. Same with the camera, though I do think people blow it out of proportion a lot of the times. FromSoft have never been the best at that, and Elden Ring is no exception. The lock-on doesn't always work properly and instead just resets your camera, as if someone in the history of the entire world has ever wanted that as a feature. Continuing with the combat, why does the map have to be like this? Let me open it in combat. Jesus Christ, what's the worst that could happen? You stay in combat for like 5 hours after you run away from enemies. Even without testing, in theory it's easy to see how things like this are completely unnecessary, so why? The only possible and rather obvious reason is so that I don't fast travel away from a battle, but that will absolutely not prevent me from doing it if I really wanted to. I'll just run away, so you're only annoying the shit out of everyone at the end of the day. Or make it so you can open the map but not fast travel? Maybe? More about the horse, Elden Ring did have its fair share of launch issues, such as falling off the world, or invisible enemies, or invisible horse, or the horse not summoning on the first or even second try, or it just straight up ceasing to function, along with the map and the graces. Only the invisibility bug stopped popping up soon after launch, the others stayed for quite a while. Anyway, the fall damage? Hello? It's so non-incremental that I still can't tell what will kill me and what won't after dozens and dozens of hours of this game, and I die to this shit more than I do with the enemies. There's literally a 1mm difference between you taking 0 damage and 10,000. I'm not saying make it so you can take like 10 damage every 10 feet or something, cause that would make exploring a bitch, just a little more incremental maybe. Something that I wouldn't call an issue but simply a not thing is just how irrelevant leveling can become in the late game. Unless your build revolves around 7 out of the 8 stats, you eventually get to the point where you're just putting echoes you've been collecting for the last 3 hours into health and getting what feels like 2 points extra on your 2000 point health bar. Obviously I'm exaggerating, although it really makes you feel like you've reached that point where you're trying to level everything up on your character in your New Game Plus run, but you haven't even beaten the game yet. One thing I wouldn't call a problem either, but I guess is still an annoyance, is how you constantly get items and have no way to find out what they are unless you want to go scouring through your inventory. This is something that has always been as such in Souls games and I've never liked it, but it's more pronounced in Elden Ring with the open world and its great variety of items and types of items. Speaking of the open world, our break is about up. This title might be a little confusing, but just ignore it for now. It's time we got to the part of every FromSoftware game which you might say they're the masters of at this point, the bosses. With all those things such as horse combat and maps and even something as important to the experience as the open world itself, you have to, whilst recognizing the fact that they're not a new up-and-coming company and should perhaps simply know better, at least acknowledge the fact that these are new things, at least in the context of the Souls format as we see it. Even if they were to have experience with these things or any other we might deem unfamiliar for Souls, and I honestly don't know, I know nothing about their other games, you have to acknowledge too that Souls is a format that works in a very specific way. We already explained that in the first part of the video. Souls is a very specific experience. With it, it's not quite as simple as determining if something will work the way you would with any other general format. But one thing that's not new to the Souls format, and some might even say is the central part of it, as we already mentioned, are just that, the bosses. And I honestly would have never thought that FromSoft had it in them to make that of all experiences so incredibly underwhelming. If we want to easily understand where Elden Ring failed with its boss experience, all we have to do is look at FromSoftware's previous game, Sekiro. In Sekiro, there are two specific ideas present at the same time and present in rather exaggerated forms, which is why I'll use it as an example. 1. Less is more when it comes to bosses. Learn to design a bunch of consistent fights instead of dumping everything you can think of and having 100 bad encounters. This is something that has to an extent been kept in mind with all previous games as I see it, and Sekiro is the pinnacle of it. But 2, it's also okay if you want to repeat the less significant bosses throughout the game, so long as you don't try to overdo it and it doesn't take away from the original first experience of the fight. With Sekiro, this was done with mini bosses only, which helps a ton since they can be very easily distinguished from the bosses which exclusively do not repeat. Well, there's one exception maybe, but it's not done poorly in my opinion and it doesn't matter, you get the point. What I'm trying to say is that this focus on quality over quantity is what in part made me love Sekiro as much as I did, and the Souls franchise overall. Even when they repeated these mini bosses again and again, it was done in a way that still avoided making it repetitive. Either way, both of these takeaways of Sekiro's are completely ignored in Elden Ring, though let's start with the latter. A lot of bosses were way overused in this game. It's kind of become a bragging/shock thing to state that Elden Ring has not only more than 100 bosses, but more than 200 bosses. And that's rather odd because the number of those bosses that's not reused is 8. It's Renala, Radahn, the Fire Giant, Placid Dusax, Ricard, Maliketh, Radagon and Malenia. That's it. I'm not counting NPC bosses because those are not traditional bosses to me. You can count them if you want to, but it doesn't increase the number that much in the grand scheme of things. I don't count them because they're player reskins using mostly player spells and abilities. I obviously wouldn't say the same about other bosses that are simply NPC looking, such as Frida from Dark Souls 3, or Malenia. Also, I'm comfortable making an exception in the case of Margit as you're literally fighting the same person with Morgoth and the fights are very spaced out besides, which helps. I've only excluded him for statistics sake, but he doesn't bother me. Then again, you also meet him randomly on that one battlefield, so oh well. There's still the issue of including Maliketh since his first phase is not unique, but I simply view the two phases as way too separate to discount the entire boss. The first phase is just something to get through to get to the real boss, at least in my eyes. The same cannot be said for Godfrey, whose first very important, probably most important phase you can fight before you even meet him, and in this case I think it's enough to discount him. I wouldn't say it's the end of the world, but I still don't see why. Well, I know why, but anyway, those two issues with Maliketh and Godfrey are rather subjective, so if you want to remove one or add the other, that's completely valid, but it doesn't really change the overall point that there are 3 Crystalline encounters, 5 Earth 3 Watchdogs, 11 Earth 3 avatars and Putrid Earth 3 avatars, 10 Night Cavalries, though admittedly you won't run into probably even half of them, still. And then you have a reused encounter with the 3 Sentinels, which the Night Cavalry is already a slight rework of, and so are the Draconic 3 Sentinels, and 3 Godskin Apostles, 4 if you count the one in the Godskin Duel encounter, and 4 Magma Wyrms, and 4 Tibia Mariners, and Crucible Knights, I don't even know how many. If you've played Elden Ring, you already know this. You may think it's fine, but it's an objective fact that bosses get reused a lot, and with many of these, they're already pretty bad, like with the Watchdogs, which is just a nonsensical gang-up fight, even though they were designed to go together, which most gang-up fights in this game are not. or the Night Cavalry I already mentioned, or the Crystallians who I have no idea why they exist. But they're not all bad. We can take another one, the Bell-Bearing Hunters, is an example of a boss that I actually really liked, but grew to hate because I encountered him 4 damn times. And that's a lot. I don't care what you say, it's spamming at that point. There is no way this would fly unnoticed in a game like Dark Souls 3, but it's not even in the top 5 worst reusing instances of Elden Ring, because you also have the dragons. Glintstone dragons, Elder dragons, flying dragons. Yeah, no shit, I actually think I hate dragons now. All you do with them is either run in and out with your horse, or you take to hitting their legs and hope to god they do something you can actually see and anticipate. More about that later. They are absolutely a bad enemy, no doubt about it. I was pretty much over the dragons as soon as I fought the first one, really, but the fact that they're overused so much is just... One of the many things which make Sekiro's reusing of mini-bosses infinitely better, and something that also made the Earth 3 avatars one of the few exceptions where the reusing is bearable in Elden Ring, is that they always give you a sensible reward. Sekiro's mini-bosses usually give you prayer beads, and the Earth 3 avatars give you crystal tears. It adds that little sense of excitement that can never hurt. What am I gonna get this time? But many reused bosses in Elden Ring just give kind of random as hell rewards you never use. Most of the time it's spells, or things for spells. The random rewards are a trend throughout the entire game, but it's most noticeable here, and it's almost worse than if they were to simply give you nothing at all, as I tell myself, okay, they're probably placed for spell users, not even for echoes, literally why wouldn't I skip them? That contributes to a toxic speedrunning type of mentality, along with the fact that many enemies in this game are both super hard and yet give you like 20% more echoes than enemies which are 10 times as easy. This is especially the case in the late game. But back to the reusing of minor bosses is not even the most offensive part about it. I mean, seriously speaking, it's probably more catastrophic for the game just because of how much it happens, but not as plainly perplexing as the reusing of major bosses. Astel, for one, is one of the most amazing looking bosses in this game, and that's saying a lot in Elden Ring. I'm not going to say he's the best designed one, because he's not. He's nothing really that special, but he's good even though I one-shot him because of accidentally over-leveling, and after all he's a legend category boss. So why the hell is he reused? What is this FromSoft? Did you do this? Who is this Astel Stars of Darkness? How did he get here? I know you did this. Did you do this to distract me from the second Loretta? Because I saw that one too, and I don't care that she's a phantom and there's a lore reason. Stop copy-pasting my bosses, FromSoft. I also don't care that maybe that second Astel is there for a lore reason too, cause you know, maybe they're like an alien race or something and ooh, there are many of them, that's so cool. No. You can easily do this without copy-pasting a great boss. Have the player find a corpse of one, have an NPC plainly say it to them in dialogue, or just say it in an item description or something, I guess. This is no justification to reuse a boss. Look at this, you have Godric. He's one of the coolest bosses in the entire game for me. He's probably in my top 5. I like Astel, but this is a boss that I love. He's another legend boss, and in lore he's an Elden Lord. And yet, his first phase is slightly reskinned with an identical moveset in a random encounter in an Evergale in the middle of nowhere, and I don't know why. Godfroy the Grafted? Godfroy? What? I don't understand it, FromSoft. What is this? Why is this here? I don't care about the lore. You could have all the reasons you wanted. 5 item descriptions for flowers of the region telling me exactly who this is, and I still wouldn't care in the slightest. The reusing of bosses takes away from the original experience. As we said, for more minor bosses, as long as it's not overdone, which it is for them in Elden Ring, it's fine, as it wasn't something of a grandiose experience in the first place. But for major bosses, it does. Imagine if there was another Pontiff Sullivan in a dilapidated church in Ariandel, or another Demon of Hatred roaming some random field, or a boss named Malenia, Blade of Retribution that uses poison instead of Scarlet Rot. An overlooked, I feel, reason for why the repeating of bosses in Elden Ring is so horrible is because enemies that are repeated are mostly just repeated and not repeated in any interesting way, not placed in cool places waiting for you or in places where fighting them is suddenly way different than it was before. In a way, that's because of the nature of the world. There are way more opportunities for strictly scripted things in linear games than in open world ones, but a part of the charm of reusing enemies is seeing what feels like a neither greatly inferior nor superior but simply different version of the enemy the team considered at one point or just came up with later. And as if FromSoftware couldn't stop there with the ruining of their own boss experiences, we also have the bosses that get turned into ordinary enemies later in the game, which takes away from it even more. Of course, presenting a normal enemy as a boss early on for a tutorial or something of that sort is perfectly fine, like was done with Soldier of Godric. Yet that's not the case here. You have Trolls, Pumpkinheads, Crucible Knights, Feltwinds, which are already normal enemies by the time you fight them, but they're bosses now? You know what, let's talk about this a little bit, because what the hell even is the purpose of this encounter? First of all, let's completely ignore the fact that it's a senseless double boss that's just comprised of 2 normal enemies. Why are they placed so late into the game and so randomly? It's not guarding anything, you can kill them in like 10 seconds. It's perhaps the most useless boss encounter they could have invented if they wanted to. As we're already talking about the reusing, we need to mention the dungeons. They work much the same as the legacy dungeons, but they are way shorter and also way shittier. They are all the same thing. Kill a bunch of random imps or minor dudes before getting to the final boss, which you kill in like 2 tries at most and never think about again. They all look like Dark Souls 2 rejects, and most of them being just another bunch of copies of normal mobs or other mobs is making me question my existence at this point. It may be that the simulation wants this channel to be my purpose and is trying to drive me towards finally writing another critique. Anyway, the normal mobs themselves are boring at best and annoying. I'll never not skip these motherfuckers at worst. Only the beginning of the game are these dungeons even somewhat interesting, and that's part not having enough damage to one-shot the boss, and part not having seen what the game can actually offer, that being sometimes interesting things. Literally the only dungeon I'm able to recall that had a somewhat interesting aspect is the one in Khalid with the watchdogs where you have to jump under the elevator. And if that's the most impressive thing about dungeons, then I don't even know anymore. There are also the chariot dungeons, which are absolutely abysmal and I can't even begin to fathom why they exist. There is nothing interestingly or uniquely difficult about the chariots. Well, I guess you could say uniquely, but not in a good way, since you just wait and wait and wait and hope you don't make some dumb mistake from understandably losing your patience. They are difficult, but they're boring as shit, which combined with the difficulty causes a reaction in my brain, that in turn causes it to signal me to turn off the game as soon as possible. There are also other instances of reusing in Elden Ring, albeit more minor than with the bosses, normal enemies for one, such as the absolutely horrifying dogs of Khalid that are what makes the area my absolute favorite of the entire game, and which are later reused in the mountaintops of the giants. That's just one of the weird things about the mountaintops, among emptiness and whatever the hell the liturgical town is supposed to be. It doesn't mean Khalid's suddenly not great, because it is, but much like with the bosses it takes away from the originality of the dogs. They're so unique to that area, so they should remain unique to it. But when it comes to the reusing of basic enemies like dogs and wolves and rats and imps from previous Souls games, I think calling that out is reaching. Those are basic filler enemies and they work, so why would you change them? Why would you make a new moveset of special bites and jumping attacks or any such thing for dogs and wolves when you can be making other things? It doesn't make much sense. It's a very minor thing. Some have also pointed out the reusing of assets other than the dungeons, such as buildings, though that is something I didn't notice at all during my playthroughs, even a little bit. It is the case, default medieval style castles especially are copy-pasted around the map a ton, but the game is so big and long that it's simply a non-issue, and FromSoft have always done this besides, other than the shacks with the jumpy stair things on the sides. Those are freaking everywhere and it's so immersion breaking because they're such a specific structure. Otherwise, reusing as much as you can without it being noticeable is how game development actually works. You can't have a special bush and tree for every little field, and I think you really have to look for this problem to fight it most of the time, which isn't the case for more important things such as enemies, and especially the dungeons and bosses, where it jumps out at you and you have to try your best to ignore it, and still end up failing. Things like this are way more worth it to focus on when it comes to reusing, not the reusing of assets. Continuing with the second of Sekiro's lessons, the less is more part, in Elden Ring you have a lot, like really a lot, of bosses and mini-bosses, and I can count on one hand the ones that I actually thought were more than just good. I'm not saying I want every boss to be a 10 out of 10 phenomenal experience, but I expect more from FromSoftware when it comes to bosses. 40 hours into the game, I realized the last bosses that I actually enjoyed fighting, not simply not minded, were Margit and Godric. Elden Ring has some of the hardest and most complex bosses FromSoftware have ever designed, and arguably the hardest one too. It also has some of the simplest and easiest ones, and that's sometimes because of the whole thing with normal enemies being bosses and simpler bosses being reused, but also sometimes not. At first I prided myself on bullshitting my way through most of the fights and pretty much any inconvenience the game threw at me. Yet I eventually realized that that wasn't something to be happy about, and it wasn't like I was exceptionally smart when it came to going about the game, but that the game kind of simply lets you do that. You don't really have to learn anything for most bosses, you can just get through them after some tries if you know what you're doing at all. There aren't many super defined attack patterns or attacks at all. Of course, again, that's a huge exception for the bosses that clearly received any attention. As I said, I'm not saying Elden Ring is easy, but the majority of the game is, for me. Shit is super samey and you're you're supposed to react in the moment rather than learn, remember and anticipate. It makes the experience feel very off, like you didn't earn it, like you got lucky and beat the boss too quickly, only it happens with almost every boss. Even if you struggle a lot, it still feels that way. The best way to put it is like this: right after beating a boss, I don't remember much about them, no attacks or anything special. They slash this way and that and throw this magic ball and that's it. And that's kind of disappointing, you know? I find it very impressive that with this game, which supposedly has over 200 bosses, I can probably describe the attacks of like 10 off the top of my head, and that's reaching. Not everything is about bosses being boring, however, because when the game is at its worst, there are a lot of bosses that just genuinely piss me the fuck off with how horrible they are. Like the twin godskins, for example. Jesus Christ, I didn't know they allowed retards into FromSoftware. Am I to understand that you cannot grasp how fights with two bosses work? What is that? Yes, what is that? But honestly, who wants this in the game they're playing? Who says, yeah, this is a well-designed fight, two bosses that were made separately and are now brought together, let's put it in our game? Not anybody that's got their head straight, that's for sure. I guess they brought one thing over from Sekiro, but it was the worst part. I mean, I beat this boss after about 10 tries or something, and I still had literal nightmares about it. Admittedly, the two of them did take on the form of Makima from Chainsaw Man before proceeding to beat the shit out of me, in a kinda hot way too, so I guess the dream didn't have much to do with the godskins. But fuck this fight, honestly. And how many dumb dual boss fights are there? Let's see. So you have the Godskins, the Three Sentinels, the Fell Twins, Perfumer Trichia, whatever, and Misbegotten Warrior, Leonine Misbegotten and Crucible Knight, aka Misbegotten Warrior and Crucible Knight, Valiant Gargoyles, Cleanrot Knights, Crucible Knight and Crucible Knight Ordovis. Wow, you really can make this shit up. I mean, I've talked about this before, other people have talked about this before, and with Elden Ring now too, FromSoft somehow genuinely don't seem to know why and how dual bosses work. Either that or they just like fucking with people, because Dark Souls 3 is fairly recent in their catalog and that game had two great dual fights, with one of them being especially impressive with its design. So it really makes me wonder when they throw a dozen fights in your face consisting of random enemies and bosses that you've already fought and were paired for absolutely no reason and were not designed to go together or even happen to go together at least a little bit, which is what all the bosses I listed are. The FromSoftware Big Boss Syndrome is also very prevalent in Elden Ring. You often fight the boss's feet while also fighting the camera rather than the boss itself, and you have no idea what's going on and what they're doing. I don't have the slightest clue as to why they refuse to just zoom out the camera a little bit in such fights like they did in Sekiro. Some of the best examples of bad big bosses in Elden Ring are just the many dragons of the game, but you also have the Fire Giant, the Elden Beast, the Tree Spirits for all their cool lookingness, and Radan and the Magma Worms in some cases, though I wouldn't even call those big bosses per se, and even Placid Dusax, which is a boss I really like in many ways, and one being his design, because he's not always in that state that demands crotch hitting, he actually jumps around the place and feels like a big boss that's alive. FromSoft tend to not get this type of boss right in their games, but they don't get it right at all in Elden Ring as far as I'm concerned. Now, Sekiro and Dark Souls 3 especially are perfect games by no means, although they are my favorite FromSoft games that I've played, and Sekiro does come close to reasonable perfection. Nonetheless, they have trash bosses too, but with those two games I can at least look at their bad bosses and think, yes, somebody out there's probably enjoying this fight, and even if that's not the case and it truly does suck quite a bit, I still often end up thinking the concept is cool, like with the Deacons or Wonir or the Divine Dragon, and that it could have been done well. It's merely the execution that lacks, and often I even feel split on the issue. In Elden Ring, this is not the case with the bosses I hate. Many bosses just suck and I have no idea why they exist at all. This would be my subjective ranking of the bosses in Elden Ring. Keep in mind that this is ignoring the whole reusing aspect, which is a giant part of it. I'm very much trying to rate them relative to how enjoyable the first encounter was. But of course, if I'm rating a reskin of a previous boss, I'll be taking that into account as well. Either way, you can kind of see my point, even though it's obviously all subjective, though at first I did think I had the wrong list because I genuinely didn't recognize half the bosses I saw at first, so yeah. And I was very generous with where I placed the bosses compared to what I actually think about them, mind you. Some quick and lazy thoughts if you want them. The Fire Giant and Radan were two huge snooze fests. Sir Gideon Ofnir was a complete another letdown. Ricard is like an almost worse Yorm, and I still have no idea how to properly fight the full-grown Falling Star Beast, whatever the fuck that is, and you honestly can't convince me that there is one. I should also mention that some of the bosses are missing, such as the amazing Misbegotten Warrior and Crucible Knight encounter we mentioned, which goes easily in the F+ tier for me. I don't see a point to discussing any of these bad encounters in length. There isn't much special I can say about them, as that's the entire thing really. There's nothing special here, it's little mistakes over little mistakes. I remember this one very specific moment whilst I was playing Elden Ring for the first time. I don't know what I was doing exactly, maybe exploring some little area and just killing everything. It wasn't anything that important. But for some reason, this thought hit me out of nowhere. Man, I really enjoyed the boss experience in Sekiro. For many people, including me, seeing a boss health bar has always been an exciting thing in FromSoftware games. It's less the case for some games than others, sure, but it's always the case to a great extent, and even more and more so the more FromSoft titles it is that you experience, and you begin to gain a greater appreciation and understanding of their great boss designs and wonder what it is that they're going to pull on you next time. And yet, this becomes less and less so as you progress through Elden Ring's gauntlet and the bosses unworthy of a health bar continue to pile up. It's a mixed bag, I guess, but I can't say it's a very balanced mix. You have some of my favorite bosses of FromSoftware, sure, but you have many upon many of my absolute least favorite ones. And that mixed bag isn't even that homogeneous. Most of the good bosses wait for you at the end of it all after you already made your way through most of the game, and we'll talk about them at the end of the video. And while it's better to end on a high note than on a low one, that's still a largely boring boss experience. So, why is this? Why does Elden Ring have so many bad bosses? Why does it reuse those bosses again and again, even if they're major ones? Why does it reuse bosses as ordinary enemies and ordinary enemies as bosses? Why does it reuse ordinary enemies too? Why does it have 100 boring dungeons? Why? Well, it's because Elden Ring is an open world game. Okay, that's not quite right. It's because Elden Ring is a really big open world game and you need a lot of content to fill in such a big world. It would be insane to think that they could have had the game be overflowing with unique bosses and enemies in every turn. So why is the game so big? Of course, it's an open world, duh. You can run around anywhere quicker than ever before. It needs to be big. But it doesn't need to be bigger than all the previous Souls games combined. I'm sure everyone would have been perfectly fine with the game being twice as small as it was, or even smaller. It's the opposite of Sekiro, like they already tried quality over quantity and wondered whether they could pull off quality and quantity, but they got quantity over quality instead. More is less. So why is it so big? No, that's a boring question, and its answer is obvious. They wanted to wow everyone with the biggest, most beautiful open world ever made, and it worked, because if there's one instance where size matters, it's in open world games. I want to ask you something else. Why is Elden Ring an open world game? Because it's not there to be engaged with, it's so big it feels like there's nothing in it. It's not there to offer difficulty to this hard FromSoftware game, it eliminates any difficulty outside bosses and the sparse legacy areas. It's not there to look good, okay, point granted. But really, why? Alright, maybe that's a stupid question too, or just a stupid way to go about asking that question. Let's put it like this. Why is Elden Ring a Souls game? FromSoftware seem to be addicted to making these types of games, and that's fine, they make them well. But when they decide to make an open world game and also make it a Souls game because why not, that doesn't mean it will work, and I truly don't know why they thought it would. An open world directly harms the exploring part of the Souls experience, and it ends up affecting the bosses as well. At one point I thought I would always enjoy FromSoftware games, at least to an extent, since swinging around a big sword is just too fun. Their games play in a very satisfying way, and yes, I'm not excluding Dark Souls 2. And Elden Ring showed me that no matter whether that has never been the case or just unbecame the case at some point, it definitely isn't the case anymore, because if I'm being honest with you, I didn't enjoy this game. I don't even know anymore if that's an absurd statement to too many, or if people don't care about that at all. Sometimes you're made to feel as if you're crazy if you don't enjoy a game that everyone else does, way more so than with things like movies or TV shows or albums and so on, and maybe that says something about the gaming community. But with FromSoftware it's a little more special, since it becomes a personal thing. If you don't enjoy a FromSoftware game, it's not because you had a different experience with it or simply have a different opinion, it's because you don't understand it, and maybe because you're bad at games too, very likely in fact. You can't simply think it's not a well-designed game. I'm not trying to say that experimentation ought to be avoided, that things that have been established to work we should stick to by virtue of having discovered that they work, as if games as an art form are something that should simply be passable, so that we get to enjoy playing around with them and never have to end up with something that just doesn't work. In a way, I respect FromSoftware for experimenting with their games while knowing that a large majority of their fanbase will buy whatever they put out next, even if it's named Dark Souls 4. And without experimentation, we would have never gotten Sekiro and its amazing and unique combat system, and even more importantly, we would have never gotten the Souls format itself in the first place. Elden Ring might have just failed in my eyes due to bad choices, and those bad choices might have just been experimentation. But that's just what experimentation is. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, and sometimes it works for some people and not for others. If I was to be given a choice to delete Elden Ring and get a classic Souls game instead, I would of course probably end up saying yes. But whenever FromSoftware's next big game comes, be it in 2 years, be it in 4 years, be it in 6 or 8 or 10, I do generally hope that it continues this trend of experimentation even more. The one thing that sits at the back of my mind worrying me now is that the exact opposite will happen. FromSoftware will see this as not a reason to experiment more, but instead as a reason to settle into this new, clearly extremely successful format and ride it out for some 3 or 4 or 5 more games, especially now that Elden Ring has won Game of the Year. And if that happens, I might just start making critiques of anime games instead. So it's finally time to continue with some of the good I have to say about Elden Ring, specifically its bosses. If you're here only for the negative things or just don't care about my detailed opinions on the best bosses, then I guess you could leave now. Margit, or Margit, whatever, is, if you don't count the Tree Sentinel, one of the best first bosses I've seen. He's optional, of course, but many end up killing him first. He is everything you could ask for in an introductory encounter to a FromSoftware game. He sets the tone, he lives up to Elden Ring's scale with his grandiosity, he's fair, but he's also difficult and will require anyone to try again and again to learn his moveset, which is ridiculously extensive for a first boss. In order to progress, you have to do the thing of Souls games, that's basically it. You can't just get lucky, even less so than with a boss like Gundyr. He's more akin to Gyobu, though Sekiro is designed in a way that doesn't allow non-deserving wins, which means Margit deserves even more props. There's also something to be said about his placement and optionality. He's there to teach you that if you can't beat a certain boss, you can always explore more, since this is an open world game. Of course, you've always been able to farm souls in linear Souls games, but here you're actually going on to progress to other parts of the game, which in linear Souls you often can't. When you encounter him in his true self Morgoth, it's, like I said, one of the reuses that I truly don't mind at all. It's very fitting, both gameplay and story-wise, that he's there trying to stop you from becoming the Elden Lord as soon as you set off on your journey, and now he's here yet again trying to stop you at the end of it. Yes, his moveset is also altered and such, but this part sticks out to me the most. It's a really almost bittersweet moment somehow. But we need to talk a little about his reusing in the battlefield again. Perhaps this was done to give that idea that he's constantly chasing you and has made it his life's mission to stop you from achieving your goals, kind of like the Pursuer in Dark Souls 2. And that's a cool idea, and maybe it would have worked if reusing wasn't already so prominent in Elden Ring and it was a unique instance. Yet it doesn't matter, because it's done only one time and the fight is identical. And I'm glad it's not more, I guess, because the less overusing the better in Elden Ring, even if it's well executed. But still, all it does is just sour the other idea of meeting him once at the beginning of your journey and once at the end. I know it's not a boss encounter, it's just a normal enemy, but it's simply too random. There's also definitely something wrong with his lock-on mechanism, but that's unrelated. Godric is another of the earlier bosses that I really like. He has such a unique look with the big weapons, even though he has all these thin arms grafted onto him and he jumps all over the place with them. He's the first boss to really display the more intersecting design of Elden Ring's boss combos and how you're supposed to respond to them. Previous Souls games often had combos which you had to dodge and dodge until you were allowed to get your hit in. Here you can get them in between the individual hits of the combos, and are very encouraged to do so, with many builds like Bleed ones or pretty much any strength build with the stance breaking being focused around aggressive play. Whereas Margit as the first Omen is supposed to be the general, albeit still extremely in-depth introduction to the game's combat, the second Omen, Godric, is a more specific introduction to that facet of the combat, which is one that is very important to grasp. Also, Dragon Arm, I mean, come on, his presentation is just so violent and disgusting, I love it. Black Blade Kindred, which is something that I can't pronounce, is a great boss, but I'll admit a large part of my liking of it is that I got teleported behind it way earlier than I should have, so I fought it thinking it was unique, when in reality he's a very slightly spiced up version of the duo Valiant Gargoyles fight, although a way better one, as it's not a duo fight. And you know, there's also another Black Blade Kindred fight. Getting teleported meant I had to fight it for like 5 minutes, and that was just very fun for me too. It's a great boss all around, menacing as hell, visually amazing, and I think it would have been 100 times scarier if I'd actually discovered him as was intended. The camera works perfectly despite the jumping attacks, and while I like the switching of weapons in theory, I couldn't help but get tempted to wait out his sword cycle and only attack when he's with the halberd, since it's way easier in every single way. One unequivocal issue is the laser slash. That thing just does not work how it's supposed to with the elevation, which is weird because the boss is sitting at the top of a staircase on top of a hill. It shouldn't have been that hard to see this coming. Mog is a boss I like mainly due to his second phase transition and how it interacts with his moveset. It's simply an attack that deals a lot of damage in 3 ticks and you have to heal while he's casting it, which just feels so unfair, and that's what's so great about it. You are fighting this blood magic maniac that basically says to you, yeah motherfucker, I'll take all your health and heal myself on top of that, what about it? It sounds horrible, but it works, especially with how his moveset has so many little nearly bullshit fire attacks that keep burning chunks off your health bar before you realize you're left with no crimson tears and you're about to die, and his aesthetic of blood and fire is also simply great. Godskin Apostle is another of the bosses that I really enjoyed because I decided to fight him way under leveled in Kalit. I don't know if he's supposed to feel like a Sekiro boss with the flow state-like way about his moveset, and also the fact that he looks like he was pulled straight out of the game, but he certainly feels that way when you fight him under leveled, since the fight lasts like 6 freaking minutes and he can one-shot you at any moment. There's also the fact that he punishes you if you try to run away, forcing you to stay near and fight him, which makes me think he's supposed to be like that, and he just isn't noticeable when you're leveled enough. Finally, in this arena there is nowhere to hide from those projectiles unlike the one in the Otos Plateau, and I'm pretty sure that's how that's supposed to work too. It makes it very tense. One candidate for best boss that sadly didn't make the cut for me was Malekith. I truly want to like this boss more than I do, but the first phase is so very underwhelming and honestly kind of annoying. I don't know if it's me, but I never learned to do this phase right. I just can't with his little stabs. Either way, the actual fight in the second phase is gone before you can realize it, which is a shame because it's such an amazing one. It's honest to god, no exaggeration, probably the best fight I've ever seen from a visual standpoint. And he has this uniqueness in his moveset I for some reason never realized up until now I liked so much. He's the one boss that showed me how amazing it can be. One of the things I like about even the horrible big enemies in Elden Ring is, little as it sadly does appear for how many of them there are, how uniquely they can move compared to bosses from the earlier games, which is especially impressive considering not a lot of them are restricted to their little arena made for them like Malekith is, and can actually roam around freely wherever they wish. Even a more insignificant enemy like the Putrid Tree Spirit that repeats again and again has such a cool way of moving. It really gives this feeling that there's something more to these enemies. They're not just stab, stab, slash. It makes them feel more real. It's almost entirely why I like the Putrid Tree Spirit in the first place. With Malekith's over-exaggerated moveset, it's like a button-mashing section of a hack-and-slash game where the boss is allowed to move in any number of crazy ways, since it's all scripted and you can't move yourself. Only you can move anywhere and so can he, and he's just fucking morbing all over the place, like Jesus Christ, what is this guy doing? If the fight was just this phase and he had way more health, then it could possibly be my number 1. Godfrey is definitely my number 2. I know he's also literally the second to last boss in the game, but he was the first and also the easiest of what you might call the 3 perfection bosses of Elden Ring. You see, in Elden Ring there are a few enemies that hit you with 50 hit combos and only reward you with a single hit, maybe if you're using a faster weapon, and also one-shot you if you happen to fail once. It's something a lot of people have complained about, not only with boss enemies, and it's in no way them being bad at the game, honestly. No, it is absolutely a thing. It didn't really stand out for me that much for most of the game until I reached these 3 bosses. I mean, at this point it just gets ridiculous. Mind you, Godfrey is, like I said, the easiest of these 3 bosses, and still you have to dodge all of his shit to get just one attack in, and not even always. And the arena-wide stomp he does in his second phase makes things even more tense. You literally can't even run away from him. You have to be perfect at any place and at any time until you kill him. But don't get me wrong, I love this, especially because the mechanic itself is just so cool and unique, no matter the simplicity. And of course, there is a third phase which gets even crazier. He becomes an actual fist-fighting warrior Giga Chad and he never stops running at you, and it's so horrifying, and holy shit, where did my health go? It's again one of those unique moving bosses, and it almost doesn't feel like a boss that was made with this engine. Now, here's the thing. It's not actually the case that you have to dodge 50 times for one attack of your own. The bosses maintain that aspect of allowing attacks during their combos in the design which we mentioned earlier. However, that's more something you might start doing on consecutive playthroughs, since these 3 bosses can be so ridiculously hard the first time around, and like I said, Godfrey is the easiest by quite a lot. Yet even still, by the time you're good enough to perform that perfect intersecting style of combat, you're probably ready and have been ready to beat the boss otherwise. I think that's why a lot of people are saying that Elden Ring requires waiting around to get hits in, and in a way they're right, since that's how most will beat these bosses the first time. It's very hard to do otherwise. Why wouldn't you just play it safe instead? And unfortunately, the first playthrough is the most important one for games like this. But that doesn't mean I don't still love this boss. I call it perfection, but of course you don't have to literally no-hit him. You have to be very precise and on edge though, and that's what's so great about him, as it's almost like he's constantly trying to throw you off and get you to slip up, and with how imposing he looks, especially with that terrifying way everything escalates in the third phase. Right after Godfrey, of course, comes the second of the 3, Radagon, the final boss. Excluding the hammering attack during his transition, which is awesome by the way, everything else is focused around this dance you enter with him, as you enter what almost feels like an equal duel, and even the arena is so well suited for this. There are no distractions. All you must focus on now is channeling all the skill you've been accumulating over your probably 100-hour playthrough to perfectly execute your fight against this boss. Fighting Radagon is probably my single favorite experience in Elden Ring. But then comes the second phase, the Elden Beast, and yes, it is the same fight. If it starts over from Radagon when you die, it's the same boss. And this phase is just kind of boring. I mean, it's not horrible, it's not that annoying, it's just one of the many gigantic bosses where I can't see what the hell he's doing until he's about to annihilate me. Luckily, you get to fight Radagon again when you die, which is always a win. Also, and I know people have said this before, the biggest disadvantage of being late with videos is that I can't have original thoughts anymore apparently. But why the hell is there no horse in this fight? It wouldn't simply help a little bit, it would make the fight actually make sense. Why do I have to sprint around, land 3 hits, sprint around, land 3 hits until I kill it? Then there's the light ball attack, which I'm not going to call bullshit because it's not undodgeable. You're supposed to, I think, dodge it by just immediately running away behind him, and that way it takes a really long time for the ball to turn around. But honestly, who's gonna figure that out? I guess you can always use a Crimson War of physics, but ultimately, this fight suffers from the same syndrome as Malekith, where one of the phases is so much more amazing than the other, though it's the first one this time, and I honestly can't say if that's for the better. Radagon is a way longer fight than Malekith's though, and also a completely different entity than his other phase, which is why it's even easier for me to separate them, and that's why I love this boss so much. And indeed, in true FromSoft fashion, the final boss of the game is not the actual true final boss, this is. Malenia is an overly difficult, simply ridiculous boss in every sense of the word. It took me about 4 or 5 hours of constant trying and multiple desperate masturbation sessions to her Rule 34 out in order to beat her. She's not the best boss in Elden Ring, she is the most boss. Her combos are consistently longer than any fight I've ever seen, and if you're using a slower weapon you have to dodge multiple of them in order to land a single hit. Yes, she does get staggered, thank the gods, but you can't reliably know if she'll start executing an attack resistant to staggering as soon as you get close enough, so you have to be extremely careful unless you want to risk it that way. If you have a very fast weapon you might be able to do that hitting in between attacks, but like we said, that's probably not going to happen. Even with a relatively fast strength weapon you have to dodge and dodge and dodge for what feels like an eternity to get a hit in, and even when you manage it doesn't matter because guess what? She heals! She has life still. This fucking boss who I have to dodge for hours. If I fuck up a couple of times my hit is just gone. I waited for that hit forever just to land it and have it be taken away from me the second thereafter when I roll a little too early and dodge the attack, but I'm still not able to dodge the next one since she does them so quickly they might as well be the same attack. And not to mention the fact that she varies her combos and their lengths, and you also always have to be careful with that and wait just enough time before punishing her, but not too much time so that she starts another attack that's faster than yours, or maybe you just stay far enough from her and do a jump or dash attack so that you can actually have enough time to land a little hit of your own. But the worst one, the absolute most ridiculous attack that any boss has ever had, is the flurry attack. This is the one thing in this game that I'll call bullshit. Call me bad at the game, tell me to get good, I don't care. This attack can be done way too often if she so desires for it to be so ridiculously difficult to dodge. If you're not far enough, as soon as you see her doing it, you'll probably drop dead before you're able to save the iconic tree sentinel. But of course there's also a second part of the attack, and a third. Admittedly they aren't as hard, with dodging the second by simply rolling through her when she dashes and taking no time being pretty easy. But the third is so fucking confusing at first. She's circling all around you and you can never tell what makes her stop at a certain place and where you ought to be dodging, and I honestly can't tell you either, even after having fought her for hours at this point. You can just kind of tell yourself in the moment that if I dodge here I think I'll be safe, and hope that you indeed are. That's mostly it. There's a proper way to dodge it, but I couldn't be bothered to spend hours trying to figure it out on my own when I could just manage to kill her as soon as I get a run where she doesn't spam the thing. But then, this absolutely ridiculous boss will have a second phase where, okay, things really don't get that much crazier, but only because I expected them to become twice as crazy, which really it wasn't physically possible. They still get very crazy. She's almost as aggressive as Hura Lu at this point, Godfrey's fucking melee phase, only she's 5 times as dangerous and horrifying, and if my previous Souls experiences hadn't been with me to guide me, it probably would have made me lose my mind. But I love this boss. She's my favorite of all the many bosses of Elden Ring, and I just can't help it. If you told me you absolutely hated her and thought she was a literal 0 out of 10 trash, absolutely over the top bitch, I would say, yeah, that's true. But I'm just a sucker for the Stockholm Syndrome experience of FromSoftware, and I've also learned to enjoy things that aren't that enjoyable, be it in games or other mediums, and we usually do think of Souls games as enjoyable only with delayed gratification. And I guess in a way this boss is enjoyable too, only in a way more absurd way. I recognize that this constant one-upping of previous boss design and its complete and utter absurdity at times can't go on forever, and that it's mostly there to keep the attention of FromSoft veterans through trying to keep alive that weak flame of their pseudo first Souls experience which they already had and will never truly have again, instead of keeping their attention in any other way and even still maintaining that difficulty by shaking up the combat a little and making it unfamiliar again, such as with Sekiro. I've spoken about this before and said that logically the Souls games should not be getting progressively harder, and throughout the specific trilogy of the Souls games, let alone completely separate titles such as in this case Elden Ring, as not everybody will have played those previous games for one. And I still stand behind that, but just because it makes sense doesn't mean that if I'm being honest with myself and you, at this point at least, after having experienced it once again in Elden Ring, and so strongly, I wouldn't say that, yeah, it's just too much fucking fun. I like the difficulty for the sake of the difficulty, I guess. I don't know if it's just the circle jerking of the FromSoftware fanbase and me happily being ready to be a part of that, or if it's just a general ego thing, or if I maybe just like suffering, I don't know. Of course, I could change my mind on this in the future, or rather my feelings could change. But for now, this is how I feel about it. Hey, I appreciate that you stayed around till the end and mostly listened to me shit all over a game you probably like a lot. Bonus points if you actually wanted to hear what I have to say and didn't simply watch out of spite, but I mean, I can't complain, watch hours are watch hours. Anyway, make sure to ring the bell, share, like, comment, watch my other videos and all of that, check out my rating list if you're interested. I also keep on my video ideas and what I'm currently working on there is linked on my channel. And as always, subscribe if you like this type of content and want to see more of it. Thanks for sticking around, and I'll see you in the next video.